Good afternoon. I'm Nayounghwan Choi. I'm the head of International Logistics Analysis and Support Center of KEMI. My topic is a little bit different from the previous presentations. Of course, the title is almost the same. I'm going to talk about Green Corridor, but especially I'm going to talk about its impact on shipping and logistics. As you may well know, Green Corridor is an important topic for the global logistic market at the national level and at the regional level. Green policies have been introduced as incentives, so it's not an option, it's an imperative. From this perspective, today I'm going to talk about some issues regarding Green Corridor, especially at the supply chain level. I hope you find this presentation useful. This is the content of my presentation. First, I'm going to talk about current status of green logistics in the maritime industry. There will be followed by a case of green supply chains in the logistic industry and supply chain strategy and outlook. This is the background. I think you must be familiar with this. There have been issues in green supply chain, and that has been very important not only for the shipping industry but other industries. At the production level, as well as at the transportation level, Green Corridor has been discussed actively. For maritime transportation, as you've just heard from the previous speaker, the industry has been talking about the shift toward eco-friendly fuel of ships and autonomous operation. And all of these efforts are for reduction in environmental pollution. They are also talking about multimodal transportation, and they are targeting modal shift. And this is an effort to reduce environmental pressure. And they're having also activities such as joint delivery and identification of the optimized transportation routes. Big data analysis and digital transportation and digital transformation and supply chain risks and resilience have been also talked about in the industry. Then what about logistic companies? Not only logistic companies, but all the rest of the companies are facing the ESG pressure. ESG stands for environment, social, and governance. Social and governance haven't emphasized enough, but compared to the two keywords, environmental side has been less emphasized and stressed. And going green has been targets for all companies. There has been a little difference and discrepancy in terms of target timing, but all of the companies share the same goal, which is carbon neutrality. Shipping companies and operators are also trying to increase efficiency, and they are targeting autonomous operation. And Maersk is one of the leading shipping liners in the world, and it is shifting its fuel, and it has a clear carbon neutrality goal. By 2030, it is trying to reduce its CO2 emission by 60%, and by 2050, it is targeting to achieve decarbonization. And I've just briefly gave you an overview. The commitment to going green in the logistic and the shipping industries. There are clear targets in the industries. And the shipping and the logistic industries have been actively identifying issues to achieve their goals in terms of supply chain and going green. As you already heard from the two previous speakers, I'm not going to give you much detail on this slide. The IMO had set clear greenhouse gas reduction targets. Specifically, by 2030, its target is 40% reduction compared to 2008 and 70% reduction compared by 2050. And alternative fuels include LNG, LPG, and green methanol. But if you want to achieve real carbon neutrality in the long term, we have to shift toward hydrogen and ammonia. Green methanol is the alternative fuel that the industry is most interested in. Green methanol is not carbon neutral, but if you consider availability and access, green methanol offers the most potential. It's the most promising alternative fuel. Compared to conventional bunker C oil, green methanol generates 95% less CO2, 99% less SOx, and 80% NOx, and 99% SOx. So Maersk will use green methanol for its 19 ships starting from 2025. And those 19 ships fueled by green methanol will be delivered by HD Korea Shipbuilding, Offshore, and Engineering. And green methanol or ammonia or hydrogen, if they are the fuel in the future, they will be supplied only at specific ports, and those ports will be more competitive in the future. So those ports will be hub ports in the future. Next, let me briefly talk about green supply chain policies. Today, I'd like to focus on EU. EU introduced the CBAM, the Critical Raw Materials Act, and specifically France introduced EV subsidy. And all of these are part of the EU's strategy to foster its green and digital industries. EU is trying to build a reliable supply chain. Let me begin with the CBAM. EU is trying to reduce its carbon emission by 55% by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. To achieve these goals, there will be a transition of carbon emission from countries that offer stricter carbon policies to countries that have less strict carbon policies. That is why the EU introduced the CBAM. So EU introduced a certain threshold. It applies to exports to EU. So exports to EU will be subject to the CBAM, and this new law will be in effect from 2026. And the EU will ban the sales of internal combustion engine cars by 2035, especially VW in Germany will stop selling internal combustion engine car by 2033, and it will only produce electric vehicles. Next, the Critical Raw Materials Act. This March, EU introduced this act. It designated 16 raw materials as strategic materials, and those materials are included in the industries of green and digital transformation. And there is a specific goal. 40% of the materials that are used in the EU should be transacted within the EU, and they should be sourced within the EU. Next, EV subsidy introduced by France. This July, the French government announced the draft of the enforcement decree on subsidies for electric vehicles, and they will calculate a score. This score is called an environmental score, and the threshold here is a 60 points. And this subsidy will be applied to steel, aluminum, other materials, battery, assembly, and transportation. And here we should focus on transportation. So if a lot of fossil fuel is used, you will never be able to reach the threshold of 60 points. So it is highly likely for Korea to reach the to have a points high enough to get the subsidy. This will have an impact on the manufacturing hub of electric vehicles. And Korea is providing components and batteries for electric vehicles, but this subsidy system will require those production bases to be relocated in the EU. I've just given you a brief overview of EU's green supply chain regulations and policies. And these new regulations and policies will have overall impact on the industries that encompass the supply chain. So transportation and the share of raw materials should be always considered when you are trying to export your items or products to the EU market. And these new regulations and policies will have a great impact on the carbon emission as well, and will create a turning point in the overall industry and having a great impact on the supply chain. Lastly, I'd like to talk about Korea's logistics industry's strategies and outlook. There is a high possibility that shipping routes and the port of call will change. Let's take an example of the port of Hamburg and the port of Copper. The route will be shortened. That means there will be dramatic decrease in CO2 emission. So if you combine inland transportation, Copper, which is located in south, will be more helpful for you. And here it is by 40-feet container. From this perspective, we need to revisit what the best ports of call for Korean liners in the EU, because they will have an impact in the change of building logistics centers. The supply chain includes the manufacturing stage, and we can also expect there will be more activities in terms of manufacturing as part of the supply chain for Korea. The Eastern Europe will be a new hub for manufacturing, especially the Korean manufacturers. Even now, Korean manufacturers have a production basis in Eastern Europe, and those manufacturers will have more business in the future, and we will see the number of manufacturers based in Eastern Europe increase. And the demand will be met, but as I said, the number of manufacturers in Eastern Europe will increase, and there will be a need for the number of logistic companies to increase as well. So I believe the Korean government needs to provide more support for logistic companies. This is almost the end of my presentation. Lastly, I'd like to talk about the requirements for the shipping and logistic companies. Large companies can cope with these changes in regulations and policies. But it's not the case for small and medium-sized logistic companies. They need more support, especially administrative and legal supports. They also need to be provided with advice, and they also need consulting. This can be provided by building a support platform. Especially they need a local support when they need to deal with administrative issues. Next, we also need to increase the pool of human resources to meet local requirements and to effectively respond to changes in policies and regulations. We need more human resources, especially we need trainers who can provide education for Korean logistic companies that are doing business in other countries so that they can get more accustomed to local requirements. So I hope to see more educational or training programs. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention.